Okay, so at this point, I just thought it might be quite a good idea to just put this basic user interface under a little bit more scrutiny, and in particular, just go over some of the possibilities that are open to us to customize this view, or just tweak it to suit our needs a little bit better, depending on what operation we happen to be wanting to perform at that time. So first of all, I just thought I'd point out that we are actually looking at a default view, and we can tell that because it just says that here. This is the screen layout area. In fact, we can actually just click on this pull-down menu just to the left here, and then we can see with a little bit more meaningful titles as to what some of these other screen layouts are going to do. So for example, if we just switch over to the UV editing, you can see that we've got the UV editor on one side and the 3D view on the other, so that's quite straightforward. We can actually also see that we've got these two icons towards the right hand side here. There's this plus icon, so that this means we can actually just duplicate this view, this default screen layout, and now we can start to customize this to however we might like to have it, and we can see we've still got the default the original default there, and now we can just rename this to whatever we want and just sort of return to it as and when, particularly if we go to then save our user preferences. So that's just something to bear in mind. But what we're actually looking at here is 5 major windows, which we'll just sort of take a look at a little bit more detail now. We've just got this basic major area of the window is the 3D view, which is where we're going to do most of our 3D modeling. And then we've got this sat on the timeline, which is another window. And then we've got 2 windows on the right hand side. We've got this outliner, which is sat on the properties window. And then at the very, very top, this doesn't look much like a window, but it's just a header that we can see of it. But this is the info window. And in fact, if we just hover our cursor just to at the edges between the windows, we can see it should turn into a double arrowed sort of a cursor. And then if we just then left click and drag down, we can then start to reveal the contents of that window, which just at this point is just showing us some useful scripting information. So if we just do that again, we can just move that back. And then also we can see we should be able to do that same double arrowed sort of cursor. We should get that at the edges of all the windows. So we should be able to then respace all the windows to give whatever real estate we feel that it needs, so to speak. Also, we should point out that at the far left of each header, we should be able to see an icon, which should allow us to change the contents of that window. So, for example, if we just come over to this icon over here, we can see there's one there, one there, one there, and one there. So, in fact, there should be 5 of them on the screen, as we can see. If we actually just switch this 3D view and then take a look at all the other window types that we've got available to us, we can now see all the other windows that are actually on the screen right now. So we can see the timeline, we can see the outliner, we can see the, what else have we got here? We've got the info window, for example. So if we can just switch that again. So now we've got 2 info windows, but now we can see the full thing there. We could switch this to the, let's see, the properties, for example, which is just duplicating that view. Sometimes it actually switches where the headers are, so we can see this is the header here. We can right click on the header just to flip it to the bottom, or whatever we might like to do. But if we just switch that back to a 3D view, by default the 3D view's header often shows at the bottom. But basically each window will have its own header, and we should be able to find it there. In fact, we can actually just hide the header by just left click in and at the edges once we get that double arrowed cursor again. And then what you're going to need to be able to do then is just search for the little plus symbol, which should then allow us to spring it back. So we can just switch many of the different details, the different window types like that, but obviously something that might cause a little bit of confusion is in the 3D view we can see that we've got these extra sidebars here, which could be considered almost like windows. So in a way we've almost got like 7 areas that we're looking at here, but these aren't necessarily just termed as windows really. These are just complementary sidebars to this 3D view. In fact, if we just come down to the view there, we can see that those are the 2 windows, the sidebars that we get, and they're just always, we can't sort of open one of those on its own. It's always going to come along with the 3D view, so we can't kind of find the tool shelf window in this list here. If we want to just clean up the view slightly, we can just press N and T, which are the shortcut keys for them, which you probably saw just towards the right hand side of any of the things that we find in menus here. So that just sort of declutters the view slightly, so we can now see that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then just this 5th one up at the top, as we've already explained. So if we want to be able to actually just add some extra windows in here, perhaps this isn't enough, what we can do is we should be able to see just some diagonal lines which are sort of at a 45-degree angle just in the top right corners of each window. And at that point the cursor should change into a plus symbol. When we get that symbol, what we can do is we can left click and drag down to split the view down, or what we can do is we can actually just left click and drag to the side and in the left direction in that case, just to split it across there. And now we've just created another 2 windows. It actually just duplicates the window, and then what we can do is then change it to whatever we like. But it hasn't actually duplicated the camera, which I might as well mention while we're at it, because if I start to move this around, you can see none of the other cameras have been started to move. So these are just sort of unique cameras now. To be able to close those windows off, what we can do is you can just left click and then drag the other way, and now we can get this large arrow which shows us that we're going to kind of collapse the view into this window, or we can then just move while still holding down the left mouse button just to collapse it that way if we'd rather. And again, we can do that by going up and down, left clicking and dragging up and down to just collapse the view there. We can actually also right click in the area, and we've got split area and join area. Those are the same options as what we've just demonstrated. So you could just right click it that way if you wanted instead. Something else that we can do is just shift click, hold shift while we left click and drag to, and then that will essentially duplicate that window into, so it gives us a pop out window, which allows us to then place that on another monitor, or just maybe just pin it to the top of the screen or something, just have that constantly in the way there. Some of the other things that we can do is actually just simply swap the view. So for example, if we just wanted just for a moment to be able to see in the large space that we've got here, the contents of the, I don't know, the outliner, for example, what we can do is just hold down Control and then left click the diagonal lines that you get at the far right corners of the screen. And so for example, if I left click and drag that into this area, we now get this sort of diagonal lined arrow, double-headed arrow, but now it's got boxes over the side of it just to show that it's going to swap the views. So now we've got the 3D view where the outliner was, and now the outliner where the 3D view was. And now we can just switch that back again, nice and easy. So that's just basically some of the options available to us to customize the view, and hopefully that just gives you a little bit more of an idea as to quickly how to just sort of get around, navigate around, sort of customize it to how you want it to be. In order to be able to move the pivot point of an object, what we're going to need to do is just employ this 3D cursor as in a kind of an intermediary step. Admittedly, that makes this process a little bit cumbersome, but especially if you're used to applications and how fast and fluid it can be in, say, something like Maya. But in any case, let's just take a look at how this process works. Right now we can see this orange dot in the center of this cube here. That represents the current position of the pivot point on this object. Let's say we want to try and move that down to the center of the object at the bottom here, so sort of in the middle of this bottom face. What we're going to need to do is just, we're going to need to enter into edit mode in this instance. So I'm just going to press the tab key to toggle into that mode. And now I'm going to right click the bottom face there just to select it. And now I'm going to press Shift and S to bring up the snapping menu. And then I'm going to go cursor to selected. And that's just going to move the position of the 3D cursor to the center of that face. And now what I need to do is exit out the edit mode back into the object mode. So I'm just going to press the tab to toggle that again. And now what we're going to need to do is press this kind of like a bizarre lobster claw that you're going to need to do now with this hotkey, which is Shift, Control, Alt, and C. If you can believe it. And then the option that we need is just this origin to 3D cursor. And as you can see now, the position of that orange dot, which represents our pivot point, has now dropped down to the center of that face, or the location of the 3D cursor. If we want to be able to center the pivot on this object, that was one of those other options on that previous hotkey. So we can go Shift, Control, Alt, and C again, and then we can see we've got this origin to geometry, and that essentially is just going to center the pivot of the object. So just one more time, I'm just going to left click out onto the space there just to reset the, just sort of move the 3D cursor off out of the way, just to repeat the process. So what we're going to need to do is just go, so say again, we want to be able to move it. In fact, let's just choose this vertex here. What we're going to need to do is just tab into edit mode. I'm just going to select the vertex out of the various different component modes there. So I'm just going to press Control Tab to bring that up. So right click that vertex and then go Shift S and then cursor to selected, then tab out of that and then go Control Shift Alt and C and then go Origin to 3D cursor, and then that's essentially done all those steps there. And that's how you would move the origin in any given object. Something that is definitely worth pointing out as early on as possible, just because of how purely useful it can be, is the use of the spacebar search function. And this particularly is true for anyone who doesn't happen to be that familiar with the interface and isn't quite sure where every single item happens to be in the every single menu. And that's because this spacebar search function is going to allow us to get access to every single tool at the location of the cursor. So if we just press the spacebar now, we can see we get this little search dialog that shows up now. And so long as we know what the name of the tool happens to be, and even if we only know a little bit of the name, so for example dupli, so long as we know it's duplicate objects or something like that, we can now go in and just select that item from the list, and then we can see we've got access to be able to duplicate that object right there. No, as I say, this is the context sensitive, so if we were to tab into edit mode and then were to look for duplicate objects, we don't have that option showing up here in the results. But if we were to look for, say, something like the knife, we can see we get that option there, and now we can launch into the knife tool and just make a simple cut like that. And now if we were to tab back into object mode and then press the spacebar again and now look for the knife tool or anything to do with the knife tool, we can see that nothing is showing up. What this basically means is it's going to allow us to not clutter up the view, not to clutter up the search results with things that aren't going to be applicable in this current context. So that's just going to help us out, really. It's worth noting also that the spacebar, this spacebar search tool, it gives us access to sometimes tools that don't feature absolutely anywhere else in the user interface. So we're going to sometimes have to rely on this. Also, it gives us a chance to get serendipity on our side and maybe just start to look for, so for example, if I just tab into edit mode, maybe there's something to do with extrude that we weren't actually quite sure that we could only extrude edges, for example. Maybe we didn't know that that option existed. So sometimes you can get turned on to some new tools or features that you didn't know exist. Or so, for example, if we look for bevel, we can see there's a couple of options there, and maybe just there's other things that show up basically. So maybe there's something to do with vertices, extrude only vertices, for example, or select loose vertices edges might be quite useful. So there's many different ways of being able to explore in there, but just how useful it is, it's definitely worth knowing about this as early as possible.